My name is Mima Cataldo. I am a photographer and a sociologist and a mother and a worker and all the other things that most of us involve ourselves in. And I've done these social documentary projects in the beginning of my photographic career, which I think laid a good foundation for me to be able to then move on and do other kinds of projects. Never quite as extensive as these, but they definitely informed me about how to do a serious, in-depth look at something, both with a camera and with a microphone and pencil and paper.
You have a really interesting educational background, teaching background. So can you just tell me about, you were teaching visual sociology, sociology. Where did photography kind of come in for you? Were you always making photographs, or was there a moment when you turned to it for a particular tool or project?
In my case, my early years were spent thinking I was a painter. So I was always drawing and painting. And then when I had graduated from college, I'm from New York City. I'm from Forest Hills. So I was living in Manhattan, and I just got this urge to see what photography would be like, because I was getting a little frustrated with art. So I took some photography classes at School of Visual Arts and realized, oh yeah, this is going to be my art, I think. So I just began doing a lot of photography in New York City, mostly street kind of photography. And then I decided to go to graduate school at Syracuse in 1974. And I was in this interdisciplinary social science program that was part of the Maxwell School. And so that at the time, they were allowing people who were graduate students there to sort of construct their own program, whatever they wanted to do. And so I had a master's in psychology from Columbia University, but I didn't really want to be a psychologist. And so I was able to merge sociology, which seemed more suited to me, and psychology. And then the very next year of graduate school, I hear about this new emerging field within sociology called visual sociology. And do you know who Howard Becker is? Okay, so he was sort of he was a very prominent sociologist from Chicago, and he sort of helped spearhead this movement to incorporate photography into sociology, because at the time there was this effort to move away from quantitative analysis to more qualitative analysis. And so all of a sudden, all these people sort of came out of the woodwork who had been photographers, but were also sociologists, who then wanted to use that as one of their methodologies. And so I latched onto that because I realized that I really wasn't sure I was going to be an art photographer or a journalist. I wasn't convinced that those were my areas. And here I was really in sociology. So this seemed like a way of combining all these interests for me. And so I worked with those folks, and I did a project in the later 70s on the construction of high voltage power lines in upper New York State. So then I realized that what I was doing was sort of a cross between social documentary photography and something more academic within sociology. So that became sort of my little area, even though my dissertation was not using photography at all. It was using video, and I was and that topic was on nonverbal communication. So I was analyzing people who were interacting in these face-to-face communications and sort of trying to measure indicators of status and the kinds of things that at the time were interesting to me and my major advisor at the time. So it wasn't arty at all. It was very straightforward and quantitative. And then I taught at the university some of this visual sociology. And it was really exciting because a lot of the students there were people like me who had both an artistic background and an academic interest, and wanted to find a way to broaden that and put it together and, present something that told us about society in a way where we spelled out what the photography was sort of teaching us about what we were studying, So it was very interactive.
I want to come back to that, but I want to just kind of ask you first. I'm really curious about teaching visual sociology. What were the kinds of assignments and projects? Like what did the study kind of entail?
Well, I asked students to do projects, a final long-term project in which they would actually enter a setting and, explore it photographically, and then come back and show us those pictures, put them up on the wall. And from the information within the pictures that people asked questions about or didn't understand, or what they explained to us was happening in that setting, it would really lead you on to the next kind of thing you're going to be sort of trying to document when you go back into that setting. And so in that sense, it was very organic. That's what I ended up doing with the Powerline project. I did that for 3 years, and I would stay in people's houses and I would photograph their kitchen table and, just everything that involved their life that helped explain what made them be activists. I mean, these were very rural people who didn't see themselves as activists or as progressive even, but yet here they were putting their bodies on the line to stop these power companies from coming in and putting in these high voltage power lines on their farmland and on their properties with cows and chickens and everything else. And, they were feeling personally threatened by that. And the more they learned about it, the more they became politicized. And a lot of them spent time in jail, to, stand up for what they believed in. So I sort of had that as a model for how I was able to teach then a class and sort of let those students be able to have that same kind of experience. Like let the images help inform you about what you're discovering, what you're doing.
How did you get into that project? Because it really seems interesting that you stepped right into this long form documentary project and actually allowed yourself to kind of discover. And I love one of these images of one of the farmers who's an older man who probably is not political, but I mean,
right.
And you could see it in his body.
Right. Yes, that man really struck me. That was at a courthouse where there had just been a hearing in which the lawyers were arguing to, not take over people's lands. And even though the lawyer was totally articulate, he was reporting to these people that they were losing, that this was out of their control. And so people were quite discouraged about that. And that's what made them then take to the have these marches and end up doing civil disobedience on the site of where these towers were being built. The way I learned about it was that the community darkrooms in Syracuse, where I had been doing my darkroom work, the two people who ran that were Phil Block and Tom Bryan. And it was before Menschel came in and reconstructed the whole light work atmosphere. He gave them all this money and they were able to, now have a bigger gallery space and better facilities. But Phil and Tom started the community darkroom and light work. So I got to know them because I was doing my darkroom work over there. And then they began to offer these grants for local photographers to pursue a project.
Were those Menschel grants or were they?
Menschel wasn't involved yet.
Okay.
Okay. And I would show Tom and Phil work, I'd ask questions. How do I do this? How do I do that? And at one point I said to them, I really have this interest to work on some kind of a longer project. I was at that point writing my dissertation. So I really didn't have to be in classes and do a lot of stuff. And so I was able to sort of take on another project because I really wanted to understand how photography could bring people to a new place, to a new understanding. I mean, remember, this is the 70s. So we were all in that head of like, well, look, I could do this now, and this will educate people and this will move people along in their consciousness. So, that was always my purpose. I mean, by that time, I'd been pretty politicized. I'd had some interesting connections to socialists in New York City before I moved to Syracuse, so that I was already pretty political in my thinking. And and I also worked with another, just as a quick aside, I also worked with another set of women at the university during that time to help establish the women's studies program there. So I was pretty active as best I could be, with also writing a dissertation and doing everything else I was doing. So Tom was one of the founders of the community darkroom. And when I told him I wanted to do a project, he said, oh, these people north of us that are up by the Canadian border are, you might be interested in what they're doing. They had just kind of gotten their program off the ground, and they were getting articles in the Syracuse newspaper about what they were doing. At the same time, there were people in Minnesota who were being much more radical about their opposition to these high voltage power lines. And they were blowing up towers. And so it became like, well, we're going to go that far kind of thing, So he said, why don't you go check it out? So I drove up. I ended up becoming friends with not friends, but just connections to some of the people, and then I would walk through these fields taking pictures of the cows and the towers as pieces of it were being pulled in and sort of plunked down on some area of land. The land was being cleared. This was prime farmland for people. All of a sudden, they now had their fields were getting destroyed with these things. So I realized, oh, this is going to be the project I'm going to do. And so I kept going back throughout that. That was like in the summer, I think. And then even as the winter came, I didn't go up there in the winter because it's really too difficult. But then once the weather cleared, I was able to document. And these folks let me know about events that were coming up so that I could then make the trip up there. If you look at the map of New York, right at the Canadian border in a town called Fort Covington, that's where this initiated, because the power authority that was putting these towers up was contracting with a Canadian company or something, because they were going to create a dam way up north. And this was also following the New York City blackout that had happened. So this was an effort to make sure there was going to be a lot more power in the downstate area of New York. And so the people whose land this was on was never going to benefit from these towers. And, let me just say another thing about this. There's this effort now to stop this 5G from coming, and it's the same thing. It's the same problem. This business of these electromagnetic radiation frequencies that are going out that are, there's no proof that it's safe. So this is exactly the same kind of outrage that people felt then in the 70s. And here we are now fighting it here in Petaluma,
That's a really interesting story. And so when did you hear about the Women's Peace Encampment? And it's interesting because both are about land use,
right,
social injustice, civil rights, but two very different approaches to protest as well. Like the second piece is more, you really are protest, but then you set it up as a story, like you said, making the camp and these different aspects of it. So if we could just go into, just sharing more about what that experience was like, what kind of camera were you using? I'd love to know like that. And were you using Syracuse as your base? Did you go in and print and work and shoot and then?
So I finished the Powerline project in 1978, 79 or somewhere in there. And that was the same year that I finished with the PhD program, and then I got married. And then 2 years later, I had children. So now I'm working only part-time and I'm trying to manage all of these things. But at the same time, since the 70s, I had been working with 4 other women who were all photographers who we would meet on a monthly basis and just share our work with one another and talk about the process. One of them was a woman about 20 years older than me at the time, who was originally part of the Photo League. And she was also very political.
You remember her name?
Yeah, Ruth Putter. She was the co-author with me on the book. By now, so it's now 1983, and I was kind of wanting to do another project, but I also had, my children were born in February, so I had a 2-year-old and a 5-month-old. And so she told me about the encampment, which was actually about 40 miles from Syracuse. And she said, let's go out and photograph it. And I said, okay. So we went and it was making news headlines in the Syracuse papers that this was actually going to be happening. And so it opened on July 4th in 1983, and it sort of ended on Labor Day. That's when all the action took place. So I went with her the first day, and right away, I mean, it was amazing to me. Right away, I saw, oh, this is historical. All these women coming from all over the country. They expected a couple hundred, they had thousands of people. And they bought the property next to the Seneca Army Depot so that they had a safe place to always come back to. No men were allowed on that property except in the front lawn. And you just camped in the back. And this was based on the previous 2 years of Greenham Common in England. These women were doing the exact same thing. So this was the precursor to the encampment here in New York, but they didn't own the land. And so they were constantly being arrested and pulled away from their protests. And what this was protesting was the fact that the Seneca Army Depot was storing these cruise and Pershing missiles, which were nuclear weapons, really, and they were living in the ground there, and they were going to be shipped to NATO bases in England and France and every other place. And so what I saw happening as soon as I got there, I mean, I actually found myself thinking, oh my God, this is so transforming to be here. I felt transformed. Once you got on their land and then you saw how these folks were putting these pavilions together, setting up camp, making an outdoor kitchen, doing all this work all around creating a safe place for women to then go and march and protest these nuclear weapons. So then Ruth and I decided that we would go as much as we could. And so most of the time I'm dragging baby equipment and babies and nursing as I'm walking and all this kind of thing, but it was great. And it was wonderful to meet these women. They were so committed to peace. I saw this as a combination of the peace movement and the women's movement coming together in a new way that I hadn't ever seen in my lifetime like this. And so I thought, oh, this is really history in the making here. We better document this. So we did. We went once or twice a week all summer and photographed it, talked to as many people as we could. And then after a few weeks, I said, we really should write a book about this. We should really collect other people's work, because we saw a lot of people had cameras, not like today, but a lot of people were there who were serious photographers. People were writing poetry, writing this, writing that. It was just a really unique environment. And I meant to tell you, did I tell you about this thing that's happening at the Everson next week?
Yeah, you did. Yep.
Okay. Right. And so through this weird sense of connections, I was able to meet this woman who lives in Sebastopol, who was one of the original organizers of this. And she sees herself in my photographs. She said, oh, that's me. And I'm thinking, holy Toledo, I never thought I'd see any of these people again, So
what was it like for you to make images? What kinds of things were you drawn to? I mean, those images of the women doing the performance are really striking. The image of the woman with the baby in the foreground. Tell us how you thought about some of these, to me, the most interesting images that I really love.
Well, I think it's because I have this sociological background as well as a visual background, that I felt it came together in that project. I mean, I could see the sign that says no shelter, and here's this woman holding a baby who's sheltering the baby. And it's like, oh my God, look at that connection there, and the performance art at the gate was so beautiful because these women had no music. They were just doing some gestures all around the threat of nuclear annihilation. Some of them would land on the ground and then somebody would do a chalk drawing around them. So everything was so moving to me. I mean, these people took this so super seriously. There was nothing frivolous about it. And so anyway, so I used a Leica camera. The people that had taught me at School of Visual Arts said, if you're going to do this, you're going to be serious, get a good camera, know what you're doing. And I always set up a darkroom, either when I was living in New York in my house, in a closet, or then when I got to Syracuse, I was able to use the community darkroom facilities. So I only use black and white film, and I took some journalism courses at the Newhouse School at Syracuse so that I sort of learned how to capture the moment and do, I sort of learned the principles of impactful pictures at that point. So that together with the sociological eye, I was able to put those things together. And I realized that as we were doing this, there was, there were divisions in how you would see this project, from daily life and how you get through the day to the demonstrations. Then there were the counter demonstrations, the local conservative people who said terrible things to these women as they were marching, just like today. And, we're protesting the protesters because their jobs and livelihood were also attached to the depot. So they were very threatened by this. And, and these women were pretty brazen. I mean, the reason men could not be on the property is because women, if they wanted to, they could walk around without any clothes. Hanging the bra on the telephone, if you remember that photograph, that's what that sort of represented.
So it was also a space for women to feel free, like it was a political expression, but also expression of femininity, and a safe space for that.
Yes, that's exactly right. And they were celebrating their womanhood. They were really celebrating themselves as women who were taking a stand here. A lot of lesbians there, but a lot of non-lesbians. So, it didn't really matter. Everybody felt like we were all in this together. And there was a sense of community there that I had only experienced in other women-only settings, like in women's studies classes, or there was a women's center in Syracuse when I first had kids, and they told you all about La Leche League and how to be a mother and all this sort of thing. So, so I always had been drawn to these women-only cultures that I felt strongly connected to. And I was also part of those early consciousness raising sessions back in the early 70s, So to me, it was part of my, sort of political awareness.
Were there images that kind of impacted you in your work or in your thinking about photography? Were there photographers whose work that you looked to, or personal images in your life that impacted your view of the world, that you thought, this is the power of photography, or this is how photography?
Yes, I mean, like I studied a lot of that deliberately, looking at social consciousness photographs or people who believed they were making a difference with their work. I just learned the history of photography, and I saw where this fit into everything else, from, art photography to, sort of more political stands. But I was really inspired by the Photo League and all these progressive organizations that really encourage people to tell the truth with your photography and not sugarcoat it. And, and I think it's also because the two photographers that taught me my initial class at School of Visual Arts were street photographers. So as far as they were concerned, they were telling me, you tell a story with your photographs. That's your purpose here. It's, you're so that became like my mission in a sense, like, let these photographs tell a story. I'm not taking snapshots. I'm not taking pretty pictures. I have no interest in, in nudes and flowers and landscapes in that sense, in that traditional sense. I mean, I just saw it as having a purpose beyond that, not just to hang on your wall, make people think about things.
Yeah, and you put it into this book form, and so it's interesting. How did you feel that book would function? It looks very revolutionary for its moment. It's sort of academic, but it's not. It's not a photo book. It's something else. So it's a really interesting form. How did you see it as a book?
I'm so glad you're asking these questions, because I always fantasized I would talk about this one day, because it's okay. So what inspired me was the idea that there were other people who were making photographs of things I wasn't even available to know about. I just wasn't there that day or whatever it was. And so I realized that because I saw this as a important historical event, right away I said to Ruth, this book can be divided in this way, and we should really use other people's work to tell the story. And then it all sort of started to fit together, so that somebody who wrote a poem about camping and hearing the helicopters overhead, and then wrote this, beautiful poem about feeling threatened by that she was in their crosshairs, told it much better than I would ever say that, So, and then because I was still connected to the university in an indirect way. I mean, I'd graduated by that time, but still I knew everybody at the university. So I was, and so I said, I think we should make this an academic book and get a university press. We sent it out to a bunch of other presses. Nobody was interested. And then we had this issue. The woman who's the last author on this, she was married to somebody who had a book published by Temple University Press. So she knew somebody there and said, well, let's try sending it there. So we ended up involving this other woman then, and she became an author on this, which I wasn't happy about. But anyway, she made the connection to Temple. And then once they took a look at it, and once we saw that they had a sort of area of photo books. So they had an interest in visual studies of some sort. So we sent them the book and they said, oh, sure, we'll publish that for you.
But it's interesting that you saw it as, so the photographs could function and say some things, but that the text would say other things, and that they would give this kind of fuller experience of the place, but they would interact together, kind of giving.
Right, because I didn't see myself as a writer, and neither did Ruth. So I didn't feel that we could put the narrative together as well. So it made sense to look for writings that existed that did that for us. So we were essentially editors, and everybody told the story from their point of view. Then, just so you know, they gave us $1,000 as an advance on the book when they first agreed to publish it. And we gave all that money away to all the people who contributed. We sent them all like $25 or whatever it was, and used up all the money. And then when Temple came along and actually finally published it, I thought they didn't do a great job. The pictures aren't reproduced very well. They were sort of a lousy printer, I think. They didn't treat it like a photo book. They treated it like a trade book,
Right.
kind of
thing. It's like, how does it, that's a problem still today. It's like,
and they sent it just to university libraries, and that's all they did. They only made 1,500 copies of it, and they sent it to all the university libraries and a few other places, and that was it. They never marketed it. They never really promoted it. And Ruth and I ended up buying a bunch back from them so that we could give it to people. So
it's interesting that you replicated, you documented a space of community and sharing and collectivity, and then the book is an example of community and collectivity, and then you gave away the money as an example.
I know, it's such a contradiction. And we had a terrible issue with the woman who was the third author. Temple wanted us to use this woman named Alice Cook, who was someone that they had published, who was a historian at Ithaca College, to write an introduction to the book. They wanted a 20-page introduction. I didn't feel confident to do that yet. And I thought of people at Syracuse that I would have asked, but they suggested, no, let's do this other woman. So when they asked her, she didn't want to do it. She was retired, she was tired. And so she ended up recommending this woman who became the third author, who was really like a local writer in Ithaca. And she'd been involved with this sort of bourgeois kind of demonstration that had happened. It was a minor incident in the whole scheme of things of that summer, but she spends a lot of time writing about that. And we had issues with her, and we tried to get her to, come more over to what we were wanting her to say. And Temple ended up letting it go and sticking with her. And so the two of them ended up becoming co-authors on this. And I was like, how did that happen?
How'd that happen? This is what happens too. Can you tell me, what kind of lessons did you take from the power lines into this project on Seneca? And I mean, it's not like you had a second chance to come back the next year and get it right. Like, you had to do it.
Well,
and you made some incredible images.
It's so funny you're saying this, because my thought process was, I just took myself out of the academic labor force around 1981 when my son was born. And I kind of have to have something to show that I'm still academically involved, even though I don't have a job and I'm taking care of two little kids. So when this project came along and I saw what the potential for it was, the first time I went there with Ruth, I really realized when we decided that it was a bigger project than what we could do, but that it was really important to document it. It was really important to put this out for the world to see, because the power line thing, those folks failed. I mean, there are power lines all over their property today. So even though I had the experience of participating in that process with them, nothing came of it from that for them or for me. So when this opportunity came along to do the peace encampment, I realized it was like even bigger in some ways. And because there were so many people finding ways to record their experiences, I thought, oh, this is a huge amount of information that we could gather, that we could then distill into telling a particular story. So then that became our mission in the last half of the summer, to talk to people who were also photographing and have their contact information and tell them we want to put a book together. And then the book started just happening in my head, like how it could be organized, what was important to document, and then how to get photographs of things that we weren't there to document ourselves. And then we spent like 2 more years after that summer of 83 to put it together, to gather all this. And Ruth, she came from a wealthy husband. She had this huge space in one of the levels of her house that we were able to set up this monstrously long table and actually start laying things out. And by doing that, you could really see what connected with what and where the divisions were, and what we wanted to show, and what work showed the best image of whatever we thought was happening at the time that we needed to show.
You describe photography as interaction. And I love that. And I just wanted to hear your thoughts on, how you see photography as interaction, and what you think you gain from it as a photographer. What do you think viewers gain from it? And it's fascinating that you write that as a part of your work.
Well, let me just promote one thing here. I put this book together. It's a book that I made 2 years ago. And so it's divided into these 2 projects that we did, that I've done, and then the rest of the work I've done up till the present. And I do see that because those projects involved so much connection to the people involved in them, that my perspective was the process is an interactive process of making the photographs. These people are presenting themselves, and after a point, they aren't presenting themselves in any particular way. They're just being who they are. But they're allowing you into their space, which I consider a privilege, because a lot of people, oh, don't take my picture, and do all kinds of things. But eventually, if you establish trust with people, they're just gonna let you do whatever they want, and they're gonna be more relaxed and more honest. And I mean, we never got as far as saying, "Are you okay with this picture that we chose of you?" You know, we didn't go that far. But it's the process of working with people. I just don't see myself exploiting people. I'm not taking advantage of anybody in any way. I'm just recording what's going on. So I think it has to do with my attitude about it, you know.
I love that. And I loved hearing the arc of the teaching and the way in which your studies as an academic have informed your photography.
Right.
It's a really interesting dialogue.
Right.
And you're like carving out another kind of academic study. I mean, as
Yes.
you started out with like, what is visual sociology? And then how does photography actually offer us things that we can't explain?
Exactly.
How do you explain that older man? How do you explain that? How do you explain the significance of that, or the image of those women dancing? It like reaches beyond what
Right.
we can articulate.
That's right. It comes out of their hearts. You know, they were so interconnected, those women. And there's another photograph I have in which it's not that same group of women, it's another group of women, but then there's all these people watching them, and their faces are like, oh my God, look at this, you know. So we were all in that frame of mind. I mean, I always kept coming back to this word transforming for me, because here I am, I'm in my late 30s, and I felt like, not a kid, but I felt like I'd been exposed to something that had never happened before in not only in society, but 40 miles from my house. It just was a very moving experience. Every time we went there, I was transformed myself by it, you know?